Thank you, everyone. So I'm briefly introducing the seminar and the speakers, and then I'll be sort of compare. But just a brief background for about 2 minutes. Alan Moorhead, who appeared in the middle, who appears on the flyer today, described the rats of Tobruk as Australians swarmed everywhere and they looked magnificent. None have seen such troops before them. They had adopted a new uniform during the long months when they were fattening and working in the sun. Their bare backs and shoulders fascinated me. They were burnt brownish black by the sun. Under the shining skin, the muscles bulged like tennis balls. The World War II correspondents were as captivated by the Anzac legend as their journalistic predecessors in the war before. And they provided the template for one of the most enduring and potent narratives in Australian history. And the two parallel themes, the unique Australian character and the birth of a nation. Australia, as we will find out today, has an impressive and enduring tradition of war journalism. Correspondents like Moorhead, cinematographers, artists and photographers who reported on wars involving Australian troops and those conflicts which did not. And Victoria has no less contributed to that roll call, from Donald MacDonald, which is an unusual name, but anyway, who was the first Australian war correspondent in the South African War, William Lambie, who had the misfortune to be the first that died on the battlefield, World War I correspondents, and Mark will talk about Philip Schuller, Keith Murdoch and Henry Gullett, he won't talk about those necessarily, and of course the World War II cohort, who have established enduring reputations. There are also the less well-known, and they include two of my favourites, and if you just bear with me, Godfrey Blunden, who was a World War II correspondent, covered 12 theatres of war, and was the first Australian to report from the battlefield and the front line on the Eastern Front, the Holocaust, where he issued a report telling public in Australia they were killing the Jews. The other one was Sam White, another World War II correspondent and quixotic fellow traveller, who had the misfortune, according to MI5, of being Russian and a Jew. To apparent transgressions, and MI5 continued to watch him for the rest of his career. And there are also the more recent group, including photographers Jason South and John Fedder, who've covered wars involving Australian troops and some of the more horrific genocides. At the heart of the discussion of Australian war correspondence and history is censorship, which we will talk about no doubt today. 101 years after the Gallipoli campaign, it's debatable whether we are any more informed about a military campaign in Afghanistan, and it is essential for a democracy to have a free and fearless press. And of course, it's not just the legacy of the Victorian correspondence, truth in the first draft of history, which we'll be considering tonight, but also the importance of shining a light on conflict and the seismic changes in technology and warfare itself. The media have lost their immunity and are frequently targeted in war zones. There are countries now that the Western press can no longer report from. So it's timely to reflect on war journalism tonight and rediscover some of our great Victorian journalists. So thank you. Thank you for your indulgence. Firstly, I'm going to introduce Mark Baker, and I'll do a formal introduction even though then we're going to play musical chairs. But Mark Baker is a former senior editor of The Age, editor of the Canberra Times and managing editor of Fairfax Media. During 13 years as a foreign correspondent for Fairfax, News Corp and the Financial Times, he had postings in China, Hong Kong, Thailand, Singapore and Papua New Guinea. He's also covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and was wounded while reporting the Civil War in the early 1990s in Bougainville. He's also served as political editor and Canberra bureau chief of The Age. So if you're all tired, no wonder. A former president of the Melbourne Press Club, Mark tonight is going to talk about Philip Schuller, who he's written about. But just before he begins, he's also going to talk about the Media Hall of Fame and the Melbourne Press Club's partnership with the State Library. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Fay. Yes, very briefly, I'd just like to say that the Melbourne Press Club is delighted to be present and part of tonight's event, and more importantly, to be in partnership with the State Library Victoria in hosting the standing exhibition of the Media Hall of Fame. The Melbourne Press Club, about 5 years, began an initiative to create a Victorian Media Hall of Fame, and over the subsequent 3 years, at 3 major events each year, we inducted a total of 81 foundation inductees of that Hall of Fame. And in December of last year, we opened the galleries, which are now in the reading room, and later this year we'll move to another part of the library for display. One of the great aspects of the Media Hall of Fame has been the reaffirmation, for some the discovery, of what an extraordinary contribution Victoria, the state of Victoria, and journalists originally from Victoria have played in war coverage since the earliest conflicts in which Australia was engaged. And I would argue that they have had a disproportionately, in national terms, influence on that coverage. Some outstanding figures, a number of whom Fay mentioned earlier on, and in particular you'll see in the galleries, if you haven't seen them already, particular profiles of half a dozen of them, including one of the earliest, William Lambie, who not only, as Fay said, had the misfortune of being killed in the Boer War, Second Boer War in Natal province, but I think by some accounts was the first Australian to be killed in the Boer War. But prior to that, he was the first Australian war correspondent to be wounded in action when he went with the New South Wales contingent to fight in the Sudan in the 1880s. And of course, subsequent to that, we've seen great war reporting in the First World War, the Second World War, and later still at Korea, Vietnam. So, as I say, Melbourne Press Club is very proud of this association and pleased with its engagement with the State Library. So, thank you all for coming. And
Okay, our first speaker is Richard Trembath, who is a co-author with me on Witnesses to War. He's taught many university courses and has published widely on an incredibly diverse range of topics. He's currently researching potential subjects for a biography, but more importantly, he and Noah Reisman have just about to launch their book, Defending Country, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Military Service since 1945. So congratulations, Richard, and Noah, who's in the middle. And Richard will now have a chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Fay. Good evening, everyone. It's about 8 to 10 minutes, isn't it, Fay? Well, I'm a time fascist, as you know, so 10 minutes, okay. Let's see how I do. As I said, welcome everybody. I'm fortunate tonight not only to go first, so I'm probably the one you'll remember, but that in fact I've been thoroughly introduced by both Fay and Mark. My work on Australian War Correspondents was, of course, done in conjunction with Fay. Here's Exhibit B, the second book you'll see tonight. Witnesses to War, The History of Australian Conflict Reporting, which came out 5 years ago. I said 3 today, that is a sign of senility, which was a panoramic survey of the long history of Australian war reporting. And my background was in many ways as a military historian, and of course working with Fay as a former journalist and a media historian was possibly a good combination. And I actually thought I knew about the long tradition of Australia's war reporting, but it threw up constant surprises. One is how long it actually goes back, and that's what I wish to speak about now. And it really does go back to the times in which Victoria, let alone Australia, was a new colony. Australia's First War Correspondent, it's rare as an historian you can say that without thinking you've got it wrong. Because one thing, ever since we've put out the book on war correspondence, people have been assiduously telling us that we've got it wrong, which is good. It's being read and being corrected. That's exactly what the historical record is out there for. But Australia's First War Correspondent has a connection with the State Library, has a connection with Melbourne, because he worked for the late, great Melbourne newspaper, The Argus, in the form of Howard Willoughby. And he actually has his illustration, which is also in the book, up outside the La Trobe Library. And the war he covered would be guaranteed to have been forgotten, if ever remembered by few people around. It was the Third New Zealand War of 1863 to 1866. You better listen on this, there's a test afterwards. But in which he was sent by the Argus to report on a massive imperial effort, basically to conquer the Maori in the Waikato region of the North Island of New Zealand. Of course, there were several major wars, the Maori proving, as one might have expected, a fairly tough opponent to conquer. So I it was interesting in a sense resuscitating Willoughby, restoring him to the historical record, and I've picked on he and Lambie, who Mark and Fay have talking about, the first Australian both to be wounded as a war correspondent and then, unfortunately, the first Australian to be killed during the Boer War, because they illustrate two running themes which I think we can pick up tonight. When Willoughby went to New Zealand, it was 1863. I mean, Victoria had been a self-governing colony for less than a decade. It does show you the effect of all that gold. And he went to report on the fact that Victorian and South Australian volunteers had gone to New Zealand. It was a rather inglorious military performance. They were promised land in New Zealand. What they weren't told, that was actually in the possession of the locals, but they had to get it off them. But and he went, and it's a different world. One of the themes which will come up tonight will be censorship. Willoughby seemed to have such a free hand. He went over there, and this is pre-Telegraph, so his reports took a long time to get back from New Zealand across the Tasman. But he felt quite free, and I'll just actually briefly quote, to criticise the general's performance in New Zealand. It was a slow war, and the general commanding the imperial levies, rather than frontal assaults on a very, a traditional military foe, decided to go by negotiation and Fabian tactics. Now, I can't imagine an Australian reporter now publishing this, say, about Afghanistan or any conflict we may be in. The question is sure to be canvassed whether General Cameron could not have attained his aims better by more dashing and decisive means. If the general wished to take the village, I cannot help thinking that he could do so, notwithstanding their strength, with small loss by assaulting several columns. Now, one thing we don't see with reporters now is sort of taking over the role of military strategist, though some have suggested that they might. So we see there in this triangle that perpetually dominates war reporting, the 3 points of that triangle, one's the press, one's the military, and the other is the politicians. It's not a great image, but it's the best I can do in a hurry. And here we have the 19th century extreme, where the reporter was still, I think, sort of a gentleman reporter, very free, and an idea of a formal censorship system hadn't happened. Willoughby later went on to become one of the most distinguished political reporters in the history of this state and editor of the Argus, so a presage to a very distinguished career. The second reporter I wish to concentrate on, and both of these are great subjects for biographies, which we sorely need in this field in the colonial history era, is William Lambie. Lambie had gone to the Sudan in 1885. It was not a particularly big Australian thing. In fact, I think they hardly saw any fighting at all. This was post-General Gordon. He managed to get wounded in the leg there, which his newspapers featured heavily. But that was sort of a minor thing. He went to the considerably larger conflict in South Africa, the Second Boer War, or the Second South African War, between 1899 and 1902. And I agree with Mark, he does have some claims, I think, to being the first Australian to die in the war. In fact, he has a series of firsts he probably didn't want. He was the first to be wounded in the Sudan in 1885. At Jasfontein in Natal province in February 1900, he was the first to be killed. He went out with Smiler Howes, another war correspondent, named because he never smiled, out and was killed as the patrol came under Boer fire. The Boers were very courteous, returned his body without any problems. Lambie's death was celebrated is the wrong word, mourned extensively in the Australian press. In some ways he was a celebrity reporter. In fact, I think we see the rise of celebrity reporting a bit from the Australian point of view during the Boer War. Fay mentioned Donald MacDonald, who was captured, and was at the siege of Ladysmith, and he seemed to dine out for the rest of his life on the lecture circuit telling people about it. But so Lambie had that melancholy distinction. His companion, Smiler Howes, became the first Australian war correspondent to be captured by the enemy. These are not a series of firsts you particularly want. So what do these two people represent? As I said, they represent changing attitudes to the way that the authorities control the press. As I said, when Willoughby was in New Zealand, it was very free, the rules hadn't been made up, especially involving what would be called a native enemy without telegraph or modern communications. By the time they're fighting European enemy in South Africa, a clamp of iron censorship, especially under Lord Kitchener, was coming down with his, as Fay would tell you, his notorious attitude towards the press, he despised them, was coming down heavily. And these two perennial themes, I think, interlock and intertwine through subsequent wars. All the people up there would be able to testify to that. So, look, Fay, I think I'll leave it at that. They're both great subjects for biographies. Lambie is in the Hall of Fame, yeah, in the Press Club thing. And Willoughby, as I said, has got his portrait here. So they were the two sort of Victorians I chose. And I think, as I said, those things about censorship and freedom will come up all evening. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Richard. Our second speaker is Garrie Hutchinson. Garrie has written or edited more than 30 books. I'm not going to read all of them, including Eyewitness, Australians Right from the Front Line, Pilgrimage, A New Zealanders in 2 World Wars, An Australian Odyssey from Giza to Gallipoli, and Not Going to Vietnam, Journeys Through 2 Wars. He's currently a research fellow at the University of Melbourne and is also completing a PhD. So thank you, Garrie. And he'll be talking about World War II. I should have actually done it in order of wars. I should have actually done none, but there you go.
Completely accidental. Thanks. I'm wearing my uncle's hat. I'm sure he didn't have a head as small as this, but he was a war correspondent in the forgotten war, which was the Malayan emergency. In 55, 56, he was there with 2 RAR for a year and wore this hat, which says C for correspondent, and I have badges and stuff as well. I bring that up because there's a terrific continuity in journalism in Melbourne through wars and conflict and travel. Mark, for example, and other people who get caught up in the front line that exists today, wherever you are, journalists in Lebanon. We won't talk about that. So, hang on, I've got to make this work. Hang on. A few slides. But I wanted to, so my uncle worked for the Melbourne Herald, as I said, but he also went to London, as did Alan Moorhead and George Johnson, and he ended up working for the Daily Express over there, which was Morehead's big paper. So there's a lot of continuity there, which I like to think about. And I'll also bring up the fact that the 2 dead newspapers in Melbourne have been critically important in the whole history of this, which was the Melbourne Argus and the Melbourne Herald. In the 1920s and 30s, the Herald, and later on under Sir Keith Murdoch, not the ownership but the editorial direction of, paid fabulous sums for great writers, great cartoonists. Percy Leeson worked for the Herald, and fostered talent in a way that it makes me cry thinking about the situation today. So I'm going to have to run through this fairly quickly, but I want to just raise a couple of issues about the parallel lives of Moorhead and Johnson. They're both born about the same time. That picture there is one of Sid Nolan's Gallipoli series, and he formed a. The 3 of them met at a crucial time for all of them. Their relationship with the First World War was that Moorhead, Uncle Frank, was killed in the first few days at Gallipoli. He's buried at Shell Green. And George's dad, known as Pop, he was a return man. He was in the 5th Field Company Engineers, and he was gassed, and that badly affected him. And both of them write about that. So Moorhead, just quickly, went to Scotch. He went to the University of Melbourne, did an arts degree and a couple of years of law. He went to Europe in 1936. This is the thing about the Herald. Moorhead, to pay for his way through the last few years of his university course, was sort of stringing. He used to get paid by the line by the Herald. And he worked out that the exam results were published in the old quad up there, and why didn't the Herald publish them too? That would be a good thing. Okay, said the Herald, we'll take them, and he got a cheque. The first cheque was something like £7.50, £7.10, because they paid by the line. Isn't that fabulous? And so that was more, I mean, the average wage was probably £2 or £3 back then, and so that was great money. Saved up enough and eventually got to Europe. George was different. He was an apprentice at Trodell and Cooper, the great lithography company, of which you can find a million examples of them here in the library. He was very interested in shipping, as you can, well, those of you who've read My Brother Jack, which we'll come to in a minute, there's a lot of terrific description in there. And that's how he started off at the Argus. And eventually he became the first accredited war correspondent in the Second World War. Osmo White was number 2. So what happened to them? They wrote books that it's talked about they used to type, both of them, like machine guns or road drills. So the first book was Moorhead when he was in North Africa. The Express eventually sent him there. Fabulously descriptive. He was born to be a war correspondent, was Moorhead. His attention to detail, his descriptive writing, is just fabulous. And my all-time favourite bit is from the Mediterranean front, where the Italians have been driven out of Bardia, and they used to exist in these concrete holes in the, forts and trenches and things very well set up. Moorhead finds in there, the spaghetti was packed in long blue paper packages and stored with great sacks of macaroni and other wheat foods as numerous as they used to be in the shops of Italy before the war. Parmesan cheeses as big as small cartwheels and nearly a foot thick. This is in the middle of the war, all right? Except where some neat, 10-pound tins of Estrato de Pomodoro, the tomato extract vital to so many Italian dishes, etc., etc. All this food he found in there. So there's a whole page of this stuff with what he found. And so that's what he was doing. He was doing what journalists do the best, which is look at things, have good eyes, look at things and write down what they saw and put it together in a thing. The narrative in the 3 books in here is, reads as fresh as it was written yesterday. There's probably, if you've got 10 non-fiction books published by Australians, that's one of them. So, Moorhead, so he wrote those 3 books, and then an absolutely fabulous book at the end of the war about the German surrender. He didn't write much about Australians, because we weren't part of that very much, and even though the 9th Division and so on were in North Africa at the time, he had a more balanced view. He wouldn't have been writing that Monash won the First World War, for example. But so he was there at the end and did some fabulous things. He got to more or less liberate Norway, and was at the surrender talks at Lüneburg and all that sort of stuff, the fabulous books. He was in it, writing about it and doing it. There he is, in his Jeep, looking very... He managed to, when he liberated Paris, well, he didn't liberate Paris, but he got, he got there very early on, and they were supposed to go to the Ritz, I think it was, and the Ritz was full. So they got sent to the Scribe, and Hotel Scribe, very nice hotel, and he got in there and he thought, oh, fantastic, I'm the first one here. And who did he see at the bar with a bottle of Bollinger but Ernest Hemingway? He got there first. That's the sort of thing. They got to be quite friendly after the war. That's the other picture up there is Nolan and Sid Nolan and Moorhead in Antarctica later on, and the one on one of his periodic visits to Australia after the war. It's down there at the bottom. So what did George do? George wasn't the same kind of journalist that Moorhead was. So he was a bit Aussie White and others have been a bit critical of him because he wasn't writing from the front line, so to speak. He wasn't under... Moorhead was shot at and blown up and various things happened to him, or nearly blown up. George wasn't. So his first book is a book about reporting on what HMAS Sydney did in the Mediterranean in 1940-41, but he wasn't there. He's reporting what the sailors and so on had told, and more or less under sponsorship from the Government Information Service. So that's a different kind of thing. Oddly enough, of course, the early books of Charles Bean were about sailing on HMAS Australia and various other ships before the First World War. So there's that. George loved ships, so that was one of the things. So the books he wrote, even New Guinea Diary, is one of the things about it is that he wasn't there. It's not this Osmel White and Damian Para walked up the Bulldog track, not the Kokoda track, but they were at the Kokoda later, and experienced what that was like when they got up to Wau and Salamoa, and they went. What am I thinking of? Para got there. His dad used to have the pub at Wau, Para, and this is 1942, early 1942. He gets there, the place had been blown, the Japanese had blown it up and everything like that, and the commandos were holding that little bit of the New Guinea. And he gets there and he finds in the wreckage of his dad's pub a raffia camel, which he'd sent to his mum from the Middle East the year before. So that's the sort of thing you like, isn't it? So, Johnson... He did all these sorts of things. He wrote a book, that 1944 book, Pacific Partner, and in it is the origin of one of the great fallacies written about Australians. This is going back to 1940 Bardia, where he wasn't. And he's the one who invents this idea that the Australians, when they captured Bardia, went in there singing Waltzing Matilda. Well, they didn't. It's the people were shooting at them, and it was, it wasn't like that at all. But here it is. I was very grateful to find a little while ago that that's where it was. He goes from talking about the Marines singing at Guadalcanal. This is a propaganda book introducing Australia to Americans, basically. He goes from, he did get at the end of the Kokoda campaign to Boona and going to the little towns on the top of New Guinea, and he was talking to Americans up there, and he goes from that talking to Americans to talking about the AIF at Bardia, and it's a slip, isn't it? You go from talking to blokes and then writing about what blokes are supposed to have done, and if you're not reading it carefully, you think, well, he's talked to them as well, but he hadn't. So I'm going fast. Tell me when to stop. Here's George. Sorry? 1 minute. Okay, well, we've got an important thing to come to. Here's George in the war, looking like death warmed up towards the end of his life, and with the fabulous Charmian Clift on Hydra, where he went. So this brings together, at the end, in the winter of 1955, Morehead is on a nearby island, Spetses, near Hydra, and these are just not far from Athens, they're only about 100 kilometres from Athens. And Morehead had written one of the great bits of journalism he was writing travel stuff basically. And he went back to Gallipoli in early 1955 and wrote about it in the New Yorker. Great article, and in there he talks about looking at Uncle Frank, his boots when he was 4 years old and that sort of thing. And it was really the start of, well, firstly it was the start of his interest in Gallipoli and the Gallipoli book, which came out in 1956, which was the first time Gallipoli had John North wrote a book called Gallipoli, the Fading Vision in the 1930s. And it would just about slip from Australian and everybody else's memory by then, and Moorhead was the one, I think, who started up, because not only did his article in the New Yorker arouse interest, but Sid Nolan's there and he's visiting George Johnson, and George says, "Sid, have a read of this." And that was the New Yorker article, and that kicked off the whole of Nolan's Gallipoli paintings. Some of them you can see in an article from the Women's Weekly there, but these are the sketches. That's actually Hydra, which looks very much like Gallipoli, doesn't it? So that's Moorhead's book, Uncle Frank, that's shell green. And also this had sparked something in Georgia, and Charmian was both of them were at that time really mediocre novelists. Johnson, Morehead wanted to do something. He's writing all these travel stories, but he really wanted. He had a number of really horrible novels that he wrote, and George was writing detective stories. You know, none of them were things. But the Gallipoli was the thing that got them going, and it was George, you know, as a war correspondent and a journalist, probably Moorhead's inferior to Moorhead, I would think. But he was the one who came up with the great Australian novel. So if there's another book in my top 10, that's it. My brother, and with lots of other people, My Brother Jack. Not only for it, you know, its novelistic thing, but also because it's based a lot on, there's a lot of autobiographical material in it. Its description of the newspaper business in Melbourne in the 30s, just Melbourne in general, is just fabulous. And even, well, you know, I mean, it's just, if you want to find out what it was like back then for a working class kid from the southern suburbs, that's the book for you. So it came out around the same time as Donald Horne's The Lucky Country. This is the reinvention of Australia after the war. I'm hurrying. So we've come to the end. Here we go. So George's big thing, My Brother Jack, life on Hydra wasn't idyllic. Charmian was not, you know, there was suspicions about her behaviour, if you like. George had TB in 1959. He was very sick. He came back to Australia. He died in 1970. It's a, you know, journalist's life, isn't it? I mean, he didn't give up smoking, didn't give up drinking, didn't do any of that he should have done. And he died in 1970, which was not that long ago. Morehead, even worse happened to him. He had a stroke. He came back to Australia, Burke and Wills, the Cooper's Creek, Rum Jungle, quite a number of books about Australia, the Blue Nile, the White Nile. He was the most famous Australian writer in the world in his heyday. And then he had a stroke. And for the last 18 years of his life, he couldn't speak. Couldn't write, couldn't speak. It's unbelievable tragedy. His wife, Lucy, you know, was a great help, and he was in a car, she's in a car in Italy, car accident, he survives, she dies, and then he dies a few years later in 1983. So the Anzac thing, they're a big part of it. Going away, expat life, coming back, you know, the outsider's view of Australia, Moorhead had developed this plummy English accent. George never did. So those are some of the themes about that. So I'll stop now. I could do.
And our last speaker is Mark Baker, who I've introduced. And Mark's dimension, of course, is he's a renowned journalist and also the author of a biography of Philip Schuller. So, Mark, go for it. And I'll throw you off the stage if you don't stop.
Did you bring my slideshow? No. I won't speak for long. Thank you, Fay. And yes, as Fay said, I've just completed, after many years, a biography of Philip Schuller. When I started work on the biography of Philip Schuller, he was a relatively unknown or not particularly well-known figure in terms of the Australian War Correspondents, or correspondents in the First World War. I think he's more well-known recently, and unfortunately due to a number of, I think, awful depictions of his life, and in particular the execrable mini-series Frontline Gallipoli, which Foxtel trotted out around Anzac Day this time last year, which I think got just about everything about Philip Schuller's life wrong, about which we can talk more in and around the issue of censorship particularly. Philip Schuller ought to have been as famous as Charles Bean, because in 1914 he was chosen to be one of the 2 official Australian war correspondents to go to cover the First World War with the first AIF. That was by the Cook government. An election in September 1914 brought in the Fisher Labor government, which overturned the earlier decision. And the earlier decision had been that there would be 2 official correspondents. One was Philip Schuller of The Age, and the other was to be Banjo Patterson. And of course, what happened when the Fisher government came to power was that they turned over the decision to the Australian Journalists Association, and in an exhaustive or in a ballot process, Charles Bean was chosen. However, The Age, not for the first or last time in its history, was unsatisfied with the concept of allowing some bloke from Sydney to cover the war for them. It goes on today. So they were determined that Philip would go, notwithstanding the fact that he wasn't the official correspondent. So he indeed had permission to travel as a special correspondent for The Age, and he travelled with the first convoy aboard the Orvieto, which Garrie's doing a lot of research on at the moment, of course. Because he wasn't the official correspondent, he didn't have permission to go ashore at Gallipoli, but over time he got himself quite close to the area prior to the landings, and reported extensively, particularly on the subject of the mishandling of the wounded. Some quite sensational reporting, proper reporting with sensational consequences, which led to quite a change in the administration of health services or medical services to Australian troops. However, in the end, he managed to persuade Sir Ian Hamilton, the British commander, to let him come ashore. He was ashore for about 6 weeks, and most importantly was there for the August Offensive, which he reported with great distinction. Indeed, during that period, Bean was incapacitated. He'd been wounded and was more or less stuck in his dugout. Schuller was in the front lines for the Battle of the Neck, and prior to that for Lone Pine, and indeed his reporting of the Battle of the Neck is outstanding. He was the first to report the story of Colonel Alexander White of the 8th Light Horse, who, as we know, famously charged with his men and was killed instantly. Schuller's interesting more than being a very good reporter. The experience of Gallipoli profoundly affected him. He came back at the end of 1915. He wrote the first book to detail the account, and a fine book it was for that first draft in many ways that it was of that campaign. He then, after that was published in early 1916, he decided not to go back to the war with all the privileges of a war correspondent, but to enlist as a private soldier. And he went back to war with Monash's division, and in the end was killed soon after the Battle of Messines in 1917. And for that reason, I think he sort of faded into history a bit. If he'd lived, I think he would have had a much more important role in telling and forming the history of, or the perceptions of Gallipoli in the minds of Australians and the Anzac legend. Because despite what Foxtel and others would have you believe, he was not of one mind with Sir Keith Murdoch, or then Keith Murdoch. He disagreed profoundly with what Murdoch did. And indeed, he was very close to, Schuller was very close to Hamilton and agreed with Hamilton that it had been a mistake to evacuate. He thought that the campaign could have succeeded if they'd persevered, if the British government had properly supplied them, reinforced them, and as subsequent history was to show, the Australians and the Allies indeed did come close at a couple of occasions to breaking through and might well have done so. So he was a different point of view. The other point about Schuller was, whereas it's been presented that what Keith Murdoch did and what Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, the British correspondent, did in railing against official censorship has subsequently been presented as a unified perception of Australian correspondence. In fact, Schuller didn't have a problem. He in fact was able to do a lot. There were controls applied by censorship, but he didn't fault them. And he, and to a large extent, Bean agreed that there were proper lines to be drawn about what could be reported that might affect the outcome of the campaign. And indeed, as I said, Schuller disagreed entirely with what Murdoch had done. So, interesting figure. My book is out in July if you want to hear more about it. Or I could talk all night.
I'll begin with the title, clearly, of our talk today, but in what way do you think the journalists that either you've looked at or written about or you know of are aware of writing that first draft of history? Are they sort of aware that that's part of their role rather than just reporting? And we can begin with whoever wishes to begin.
Well, I think... am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. Well, again, if I can come back to Schuller as an example, but I think it was common to many of his contemporaries, I think they very much saw themselves in that light. You know, in those days we didn't have the sort of, obviously, the range of information and media sources. It was basically what appeared in newspapers, and newspapers were immensely powerful and influential in that time, and people looked to newspapers to really, as their essentially their only source of independent news information. So these correspondents were well aware of that, and certainly in the context of the coverage of the First World War in Gallipoli, there were so few who were able to report, only a handful, and they knew the immense influence that their reporting would have. And I think they were carried that in quite a responsible way. But speaking just a little about Schuller himself, I think he absolutely saw that, and indeed, as I said, he came back at the end of 1915 and immediately wrote the first full-length book about the campaign. And prior to that, prior to his book coming out, he published a small pamphlet, illustrated book, essentially of photographs. He took some great photographs which form a big part of the Australian War Memorial archive of images of Gallipoli and the troops in Egypt. But he brought out a picture book which was published in Melbourne in early 1916, and in the foreword to that, and I think he was one of the first to say what a profound place Gallipoli would have in Australian history, and we sort of take it as a given now that there was this enormous event, and we've seen the consequences of that. But way back then he was saying, and he did write in that foreword, that this day will be remembered for generations as a formative moment in the nation's history. So they had a sense of history. They knew they were writing the first draft of it, and it wasn't unique to him.
Garrie?
Of course, although he's not from Melbourne, Charles Bean was a journalist, of course, and he was directed to write the first draft of history. So Senator Pearce, the Minister for Defence, Labor Minister for Defence at the time, there was a meeting of the AJA down here, which was reported where that's what he told Bean that he was doing. He was not only reporting, but he was writing the history of Australia. I've forgotten the exact phrase, but he was writing.
He said it to be written in blood.
Yes, that's exactly right. So yes, and the Second World War. I think journalism by the Second World War was a more professional, would you say, a more crafted thing. There was more of a history behind it, what they were doing, and I think certainly Moorhead, what he was writing was reportage really of the North African campaign and the other one, and I think that to me that's a kind of primary source. I mean, if I'm going back to find out what it was like, that's a primary source. Really, it's not a secondary source in a way. It's a primary source, and less so for Johnson. But I think that Moorhead, he became travel writer, historian, etc., later on. I think he was well aware of what he was doing when he had the opportunity to do it.
Mm-hmm. And Richard?
I think, just take, because I've sort of chose the colonial period, that the ones in South Africa, which includes Banjo Paterson, of course, who wrote some of the world's worst war poetry there, were extremely conscious about writing books. It was partly the first draft of history. It was partly economic self-interest too. As you mentioned, and self-promotion of the first order. You mentioned Donald MacDonald, and I'm not joking, because he was at Siege of Ladysmith. He featured pictures of himself before and after. He was a robust man. Then he was thin. He used to do side-on shots.
Did he do selfies?
He did. Well, it took a long time. It took an hour to take a selfie.
He could have invented the selfie.
In 1900, but he used to parade around. This was one from the Lyceum Theatre, Hobart. Parade around and get people to measure how thin he'd become. It's a really bizarre idea. But just about every Australian journalist of any major note who was in South Africa wrote a book in 1900. Now, Garrie mentioned the Second World War. I think there is a big change by then, partly because there are hundreds of Australian war correspondents. It is the reporter's war par excellence. But by that time, and Mark's mentioned the dominance of the press early on, by 1945 it's not so. You've got various types of photographic image. So that's going to go first. And I think you do start to, you get the Moorheads and the Johnsons, but for the vast majority it's very professional. They do it. It's often not very high standard, as you commented in the book, and they weren't always interested in writing the first draft of history. Interestingly enough, one of the people I did who covered for radio, Peter Hemingway, who covered the Pacific War against Japan in the 1940s, he wrote back a letter to his wife saying he'd be the first journalist never to write a history of the war he was involved. He was very proud of it, which he stuck to. But so I think they are conscious of the first draft, but times change.
I think you're a bit hard on Donald MacDonald because he was a great football writer.
He was an excellent footballer. He was an excellent footballer.
But a selfie.
Old boy was his nom de guerre.
Given that a lot of the people that you're talking about are actually beautiful writers, they're great craftspeople. Is the better writing not about Australian troops or about the Anzacs? Because, the Anzac, and many people now groan when they think about Anzac, and we could probably talk forever about the centenary and what went wrong, but it's sort of an interesting idea. Does it inspire these predominantly men pre-World War II, or are they better when they're not writing about Australian troops? And sure, it's a difficult one, Mark, but I know you're wide across others.
Well, I think in the case of Schuller, absolutely, because his description, and I reproduce his, essentially it was his dispatch of the Battle of the Neck, and it's powerful, but it's beautifully written. The description of the scene and the moment and the emotion is really first class. And I mean, I think it was, again, perhaps it was in that period, and some were good, and been indeed, a lot of people have been quite critical, I think, of Bean as a writer who was could be a bit pedestrian, although some of his work was outstanding too. But there was, I think, in that period they were aware, they were describing things because, there was some photography, but not so much as came later. So their accounts had to make you see and feel it, and therefore great writing. And I think today, who's got time to do that?
We'll talk about technology later, and I'm sure someone's going to ask about that. Also, the fact that Schiller signed up, which is actually, there were soldiers that became war correspondents, but it was more rare for journalists to become soldiers. Was that an identification with the Australian troops?
I think there's a surprising number of journalists were soldiers.
Yes, but they don't necessarily become soldiers.
On the Oviedo, there were people from the Geelong Advertiser, from country papers all over, and that's a great thrill because they wrote fantastic letters, and especially if your mum was the editor of the Benalla thing, then your letters were
structured too.
So very structured, yeah. So I think there were a lot of it, there were a lot of other people, the YMCA representative on the Oviedo went over, came back and joined up. So there were a lot of, people and blokes who were sick, who got sick, sent back, joined up, rejoined. So there was a real commitment. Hard to understand today, but back then that was what they did.
Faye, can I just say on that writing thing, one of the things I think I noticed when I was working on Australian war correspondence, that often the really famous pieces and the really famous journalists aren't writing about Australians. I mean, you've got Moorhead, who does early on at Bardia and that, but it's basically a British Commonwealth effort or British Empire effort. But if I was thinking of the pieces that stuck out when I was researching it, a number of them aren't Australian. Bean is, of course, an exception, but I was thinking of, say, Noel Monk's at Guernica covering the famous bombing, which gives us the great Picasso painting, which, of course, has nothing to do with Australia except at a very tangential level, and he just happened to be there, and it's in fact a great piece of writing. I was thinking of Wilfred Burchett's, then writing under, for some reason, Peter Burchett for the Daily Express, Moorhead's newspaper, on the first Westerner into Hiroshima after the bombing, the famous atomic plague, which was hardly mentioned here. But that is a startling piece of journalism and totally alters his life. If you were to go through, and we haven't really covered the recent, recent for me at the age of 60, but say the Vietnam War or the wars in Southeast Asia, if you get Neil Davis, and I can remember watching the great Bradbury documentary on him, and the first time I really came across him was that he mentioned that, sometimes I'm not known back at home because I'm not necessarily filming Australians. And I think that is interesting. There's, in fact, we often think about, Monash, won the First World War, and obviously Australia won the Second World War. We all know that. And Anzac is rah, rah, rah. But in fact, I think the Australian journalists have been remarkably non-parochial at times, aware that we're often parts of a coalition and a wider picture. In fact, I think that's a noticeable feature, perhaps a good feature, I think.
And partly central to that, and if I'm thinking about some of the contemporary correspondents or photographers, it's also because of censorship and the Australian military. So I was wondering if we should sort of talk about that, because I think I said 101 years later, we're not necessarily any more informed about Afghanistan, despite the seismic technology and the access and the tremendous access that other military organisations have allowed. So, Mark, you mentioned briefly the censorship, and it goes to that first draft of history. Is the censorship an issue, irrespective of the era, and does it, of course, influence what they then write about, both in terms of their reporting, but then their later books?
Things have changed a lot. I mean, clearly censorship and so we were sort of seeing the first sort of organised censorship around the Boer War, but it sort of came on with a vengeance on the eve of the First World War, and the British government, seeing that war was pretty much inevitable, made substantial preparations to license correspondence and to control things, and basically rounded up the proprietors and the media barons and got them on board around the concept. And one of the interesting things that I explore a bit in my book is the Gallipoli letter, which really was a bit of plagiarism by Keith Murdoch. The Gallipoli letter was, of course, in its first incarnation, was a letter written by Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, the flamboyant British correspondent, and basically he gave it to Murdoch to carry to London. Murdoch got caught in Marseille and it was taken off him, and then he kind of cobbled together his own version after that, which was far more florid than what Ashmead Bartlett had written, although Ashmead Bartlett was a pretty florid writer. But Ashmead Bartlett's letter, which was highly critical and basically wanted Hamilton sacked and everybody to be brought home, was driven largely, I mean, his animus and his antipathy towards the whole campaign, I think, was driven largely by the fact that he'd had an extraordinary freewheeling career over the previous decade or so, ranging around North Africa and the Balkans, covering all these wild and woolly campaigns, living on lavish expense accounts, making bags of money. And in that era of journalism, these larger-than-life correspondents could be ranging even in the space of a day from one side to the other of a conflict, and they had this great sort of bulletproof immunity. They were, put on a pedestal and, with occasional exceptions. But basically, and then suddenly Ashmead Bartlett and some of his colleagues sort of arrived in the First World War and sorry boys, it's all over now. You don't get to do that. Your stuff will be censorship. Now, Ashmead Bartlett blamed Hamilton, but in fact, the censorship regime was enforced right across, France and the theatres of war in the First World War, and it wasn't Hamilton's work. It was what was required, and he couldn't cope with that. Today, well, basically, war's too bloody dangerous to cover anyway. So.
Yeah.
Nobody, no Western journalists really go anywhere near the action in places like Syria because if you're not shot, you'll be taken hostage, and so wars are covered by proxy local journalists who are the ones that get captured and shot.
Exactly.
I think that's the point, isn't it? You trade access for
Safety.
Trade access for some kind of self-censorship or overt censorship. It's been like that. So Schuller couldn't get. Banjo Patterson couldn't get there, or he had a particularly bad war, Banjo, that one. Schuller had to sail around, and he had this pirate-like, attempt to get ashore, Bean was there. Bean was quite conscious of in his dispatches and also in the history of describing as best he could, but also being aware of, the greater cause, that he subscribed to. And Second World War, about the only time when there was pretty much open access, by journalists to war was in Vietnam, pretty much.
And that's an exception.
That's an exception. The rest of the time, Afghanistan, we've been there for 15 years. What do we know? That ABC doco recently, was made it more mysterious than ever for me.
I was going to say that, with Afghanistan, I think one of the things there was, it's been pretty tight censorship on the Australian activities, and perhaps it reflects at times, I think, a lack of interest, perhaps, from the general public about what's happening there. It sort of just disappears behind the trots from Mildura or something in general attention. But perhaps I think what can annoy a lot of journalists, and tomorrow I'll be with a lot of soldiers, so Nara and I will hear the other side of it, where all journalists should be, expelled from the front anyway. But is sort of inconsistency, and you can give bizarre things from the Australian military. There was an occasion just outside Tarin Kowt where you would think this would be a big newspaper hit for the military, where Australians were particularly brave, particularly glorious, and were all given medals, but that was suppressed for some reason because it was the SAS and the ORS. It was reported by the Dutch who were over there, who didn't seem to be under the same censorship things. So the Australians are trying to deny it. We can neither report nor say whether it's true, blah, blah, and the Dutch have got through the papers in The Hague and Amsterdam. All these Australians have been awarded medals. That just sort of makes it look a bit idiotic. I think Australians the Australian military looking from their point of view rather than the press, don't have quite that American tradition of being able to finesse the press as well as our US cousins do it. They've just got that, whether it's sort of Madison Avenue or something, just that ability. It doesn't always work, but just to have sort of on the surface better working relationships, and Mark probably be able to speak on that, where the Australian military can often be, I think, a bit blunderbuss about it.
I think there's no exaggeration to say I think the Australian Defence Department or the defence establishment in Australia...
Mark, can you put...
Sorry, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the Australian Defence Department has the worst regime of media control anywhere in the Western world. I mean, you can't get any information out of them. They have a massive sort of media bureaucracy of massages, but trying to get anything out of them is like pulling teeth. And and this absurd situation, yes. And this whole thing about, yes, the mystique around SAS, that you can't identify them, otherwise their lives will be in peril even though they're fighting on the other side of the world. Well, and therefore, and there were some extraordinary acts. Well, we hear about the Victoria Cross winners ultimately, but by and large, a lot of extraordinary fighting and bravery by Australian soldiers, but most of them are unknown figures and will remain so, and that's crazy.
Yeah, particularly given how important the Anzac legend is to them. I remember interviewing a general, and the first place they take young soldiers is the Australian War Memorial. It's the first place because they talk about the Anzac legend. So there seems to be a disconnect, which is quite striking, but it's the public relations, and of course America does have that fundamental about freedom of speech.
Each 5 years there's a new media person appointed from the Australian Defence Force or from the various services, and they're all charming and they're all lovely,
but they don't
and
tell
they
you
love historians, and I did journalism at Charles Sturt and etc., and they come up with exactly the same attitude that Mark says, because the culture is so entrenched that comes first. And of course, in a sense, you don't blame them, you blame further up the tree from the political masters. Yeah.
I mean, the best book to come out of Afghanistan was General John Cantwell's book. What's it called?
Yep.
I've forgotten the title of it just now. But it's about the impact of the war on him, and that's not what from the defence establishment's point of view. That's not what it's about.
Well, our understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder and the vulnerability, and as you said, there are some amazingly brave young men and women, but it's a sanitised version or just a closed version. Just a couple of last questions before we open it to the audience. I just wanted to think about technology, because technology tends to parallel conflicts. If you think about the camera in World War I, broadcast and moving imagery in World War II, and we get to the Balkans and internet, and of course digital post-2000. So if you're thinking about your own journalists that you've been thinking about, how seismic is this technological change in terms of the content, in terms of their writing, or doesn't it have an impact? Because of course a lot of them are actually print rather than television or photographers.
Getting the story out is the hardest thing. Bean couldn't get the story out, and so the whole setting of Gallipoli and Anzac and everything is set not by Bean at all. Really, the first impressions of Ashmead Bartlett's, homoerotic descriptions of Anzac doing homoerotic descriptions, and Compton Mackenzie and all of those, things, but. Second World War, every one you can think of, getting the story, out is difficult, and now it's easier than it was, I think, and that's a big change. And of course, it's spread from the professionals, where you can tweet the revolution now. Yeah,
that's right, and the sat phone has transformed it for all kinds of. In all kinds of ways, but sadly the phenomenon we now face is that we have this fabulous technology and all of these technological means of getting it out, but then the problem is getting people into that space and the sort of perilous state of the the mainstream media in terms of their ability to afford to get people into places, to sustain correspondence, to have experienced people in the field. I mean, it's evaporating, and there's been a massive contraction over the last 15, 20 years in the number of people out there doing this kind of work, and so we've got great means to do it, but we don't have the resources or the companies or the publishers are not putting the money behind it.
I better mention the other gender in correspondence, and it links with the technology thing. When I was interviewing the late Kate Webb for the Witnesses to War book, one of Australia's, if not Australia's greatest female war correspondent, and she had an enormous career that started from Vietnam, went right through to Afghanistan and the independence of East Timor. And she, on the one hand, really loved the fact that she could do the immediacy thing with everything up to the sat-nav and all the rest of it. The other thing, she thought this might come at the expense of analysis. That's something I'd leave to professional journalists, but she said you don't want to overload the immediate image of explosions and all this with the thing you're talking about, Mark, of not having people on the ground long enough to give you that sustained commentary, which is not just there to sell papers, but has also got to inform a public who are both paying for it and whose country is committed to it. And perhaps that's right, it's perhaps the explosion thing, and embedding journalists, probably, Fay, you'd agree, has that thing to get an immediacy, perhaps. Not always analysis, which should be the thing of it, exposure.
And it relates to my last question, which Mark's touched on, where it's actually become so dangerous in places. So journalists, and it's not even Balibo, I think, actually, before then, Vietnam, when journalists were actually executed. So over 1,000 journalists since 1992, I think, have been murdered. In 2015, 71 journalists were murdered, 23 were kidnapped. In total, 26 Australian journalists have been killed for the duration since they've been reported. How is it going to impact on the way we consume news about conflict and news about Australians in conflict as well, that it's become so unsafe? Is it because then we will embed more because it is more safe, and then other places will just not be reported on, which is not necessarily unusual?
Yeah, I think in all of those areas there's a contraction, as I was sort of saying, and that's the problem. You've got the ability of organisations to get people out there, but even if they have the will and the wherewithal to do it, their ability to get close to it when things are closed, are dangerous. And there's another phenomenon, of course, too, is that companies, even if they're inclined to do it because of the risk factors, the cost of war zone insurance is astronomical now. And, when I went to cover Iraq, Fairfax, in its wisdom, I was one of a number of journalists who were sent to cover the invasion, and Mark Scott, who was then editorial director of Fairfax at the last moment, informed me and my colleagues that everything was fine with the insurance now. Fairfax was going to self-insure. And when I asked him over the phone from Jordan, as I stood waiting to go in the direction of Baghdad, what does that mean? He said, don't worry, mate, we'll look after your family if anything happens. Thanks for that.
Sadly, I think we're running out of time, so I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you very much for your amusing and informative discussion, and thank you for the audience. And Ruth?